All right, so today we're going deep, really deep, into the world of Shem ibn Falaquera
A medieval Jewish philosopher, yeah.
and his work.
Well-
He's not always the most uh, well-known figure,
Right.
but his attempts to bridge philosophical inquiry with Jewish thought, I mean, it's fascinating. It really gives us a window into how these ideas were interacting, almost 800 years ago.
Absolutely. And for someone who lived, roughly from 1225 to 1295, Falaquera was immersed in such a vibrant intellectual world. I mean, just the sheer breadth of his knowledge is
You
astounding.
always hear about that, yeah. Like he wasn't just focused on one tradition or one set of texts.
Right, exactly. He was drawing from all these different sources. You've got the ancient Greeks,
Oh, yeah, the big ones.
Aristotle with his emphasis on logic and, the natural world, how to study it systematically. Then you have Plato, who is all about these ideal forms and the soul.
Yeah, yeah. Two very different approaches, but both hugely influential.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. Falaquera was also deeply engaged with medieval Islamic thought. Thinkers like Al-Farabi, who was known for his commentaries on Aristotle and his work on political philosophy, and Avicenna.
Avicenna, the physician and philosopher.
Exactly, a giant in medicine and metaphysics. So you have these major figures from different traditions, and Falaquera is synthesizing all of this.
It really makes you wonder how anyone could master so much material.
And then, of course, you have the Jewish philosophical tradition that came before him.
Right, so he's not working in isolation. He's building on what others have already done.
Exactly, and that's what makes his work so rich.
And, for you as a philosopher, I think you'll find Falaquera's driving purpose particularly interesting.
Oh, I'm sure I will.
Because he wasn't just trying to accumulate knowledge for its own sake. He really wanted to make philosophy and science accessible to his fellow Jews.
To share that knowledge.
Well, yeah, and not just as intellectual exercises,
Right.
but as ways to gain a deeper understanding of the world,
I see.
and even of Scripture itself.
Oh, that's interesting.
So he's really grappling with how different ways of knowing can inform and enrich one another.
That's a core question, isn't it? How do these different modes of inquiry relate to each other?
Absolutely, and the specific currents he's navigating, they're pretty fascinating. Like, imagine trying to reconcile, the empirical focus of Aristotelian physics with the theological framework of the Torah.
It's a real challenge.
It is. And then you throw in Plato's ideas about knowledge and reality, Al-Farabi's classifications of the sciences.
And you can't forget Maimonides.
Oh, of course, Maimonides, yeah. His synthesis of Aristotelianism and Jewish law. And even the Neoplatonic influences you find in someone like Ibn Gabirol.
It's an incredible mix of ideas.
He really is.
Yeah, he was working at the intersection of multiple worlds.
Okay, so now let's talk about Falaquera, the person, the individual. Because early in his life, he was apparently a prolific poet.
Really?
Yeah, like we're talking reportedly something like 20,000 stanzas of poetry.
Wow. That's quite a lot of poetry.
It is. And then it seems like he undergoes this profound shift. He dedicates himself to philosophy, to this rigorous discipline of logical thinking.
So he goes from poetry to philosophy. It's quite a turn.
It is. He even describes moving away from poetry as a bill of divorcement.
Yeah.
As if he's separating himself from this earlier passion. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, for someone with your background. Like, what kind of journey leads someone who's clearly so talented with language, with artistic expression?
Yeah.
What leads them to feel this pull towards philosophy, this need to delve into these deep questions of reason and logic? What could have been the catalyst for such a dramatic change?
That's a great question. It really makes you think about how different forms of intellectual expression were perceived back then in the medieval period.
Right.
And I think Falaquera's shift might reflect this concern, this worry that was actually pretty common among ancient and medieval philosophers.
What kind of concern?
Well, they were concerned about the power of rhetoric and poetic language.
You mean the way they can sway people's emotions?
Exactly. They worried that, the beauty of poetry, the emotional appeal could actually lead people away from truth.
Away from truth that's established through reason and argumentation?
Precisely. So you could see his move towards philosophy as, a way of prioritizing reason, demonstrable truth over the more evocative, imaginative realm of poetry.
So it's like he's looking for a more solid foundation for knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. But it's worth noting that even in his philosophical writings, he retains this this remarkable ability to communicate complex ideas in a very clear and accessible way.
So he doesn't completely abandon that poetic sensibility.
No, not at all.
It's almost as if he saw philosophy as a more direct route to understanding, to genuine understanding.
Yeah, I think that resonates with his description of it as a betrothal to wisdom. It's a commitment.
But it's also striking that even after this supposed break with poetry, he's still using literary forms to convey his philosophical ideas. He's writing dialogues, he's using philosophical tales, so maybe the separation wasn't quite as absolute as it first appears.
That's a good point. And I think it really highlights his skill as a communicator. Because he understood that to reach people, to interest and educate his co-religionists, as our sources tell us, he couldn't just be dry and abstract.
He needed to make these ideas engaging.
Exactly. And a great example of this is his Igeret Havikua, which translates to Epistle of the Debate.
He sold the debate, okay?
And it's structured as a dialogue, a conversation between a scholar and a pietist.
Both observant Jews, right?
Yeah, and the scholar is making the case for why studying philosophy is not only permissible, but actually important.
So it's not just an abstract philosophical defense. It's a targeted effort to address those within his community who might have been skeptical of philosophy.
Exactly. He's trying to engage with their concerns directly.
And all of this is happening during a time that was, full of intellectual tension.
Right.
You have the controversies surrounding the works of Maimonides, for example.
A major figure in Jewish thought.
Absolutely. And
Then-
Falaquera is clearly aware of these debates, and he seems to be trying to forge a middle ground. He's arguing that philosophy and Jewish tradition are not inherently in conflict.
He even wrote a letter later on specifically defending Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed.
Exactly. So we see him not just as this detached scholar, but as someone who's deeply involved in the intellectual currents of his time. He's trying to shape the conversation.
And when we connect this to the bigger picture, I think Falaquera's efforts really underscore a central concern within medieval Jewish thought. This ongoing project of trying to harmonize the intellectual heritage of ancient Greece, as it was transmitted and developed through Islamic philosophy with the foundational principles of Judaism.
So you have these two rich traditions, and thinkers like Falaquera are trying to find ways to bring them together.
Exactly. And while he wasn't alone in this, what really sets him apart is his dedication to making these complex ideas accessible to a wider audience.
Yeah, this seems to be a recurring theme in his work. So let's dive into the specifics of how he went about popularizing these ideas.
Okay, great.
Our sources highlight several roles that he played: popularizer, paraphraser, encyclopedist, commentator, and exegete.
That's quite a list.
It is. Let's start with popularizer. It's like his main goal here was to lower the barrier to entry for those interested in philosophy.
Exactly. Unlike some earlier thinkers who argued that philosophy should be restricted to a select few, Falaquera seemed to believe that a wider engagement with these ideas could be beneficial.
More minds are better.
Yeah, more minds, more perspectives. And the Igeret Havikua, which we talked about earlier, that's a perfect example.
The Epistle of the Debate.
Yeah, it's basically a very accessible introduction to philosophy for people who aren't already experts. And he also used this interesting literary form called the Makama in his Sefer HaMevakwesh.
Makama. That's a new one for me.
It was a popular Arabic literary genre. It's characterized by rhymed prose and verse, and it often features these wandering scholars or trickster figures. So Falaquera is using this engaging style, this storytelling approach, to reach a broader audience.
He's meeting people where they are using a form they're familiar with.
Exactly.
And then you have Falaquera, the paraphraser.
Right.
And it sounds like he wasn't just doing word-for-word translation.
No.
He was taking the core philosophical ideas and representing them in a more easily understandable way, sometimes even weaving together concepts from different sources.
That's a great observation. And a prime example of this is his Reshit Hukmah.
The beginning of wisdom.
Yeah, which is, it's structured in three parts. First, he talks about moral virtues. Then there's a classification of the sciences, which draws heavily on Al-Farabi,
who, as you mentioned, played a key role in transmitting Greek knowledge within the Islamic world.
Exactly. And then the third part focuses on the importance of philosophy for achieving true happiness. And that, again, draws a lot from Al-Farabi.
So it's like he's creating a kind of philosophical roadmap for his readers.
Yeah, a guide to living a good life. But he's not just presenting al-Farabi's ideas in isolation. He's integrating material from other thinkers like Avicenna, and he even brings in relevant biblical verses and rabbinic teachings.
So he's really creating a new synthesis.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating from a philosopher's perspective is that he often didn't explicitly cite his sources.
So he's not worried about giving everyone credit all the time.
Well, it's more that it gave him greater flexibility in adapting and shaping the material to suit his purposes.
To make it his own.
In a way, yes. And his intended audience, who probably wouldn't have had access to the original Arabic sources anyway, they would have encountered this really clear and well-structured overview of philosophical thought in Hebrew for the first time.
That must have been pretty groundbreaking.
It really was.
Okay, so we've got the popularizer, the paraphraser. Now we come to Falaquera, the encyclopedist.
Right, the compiler of knowledge.
And this is where we encounter Deoch HaPhilosophim, the opinions of the philosophers.
His most extensive work.
This sounds like a huge undertaking.
It was a massive project, and it's one of the earliest known Hebrew encyclopedias devoted to science and philosophy.
Wow.
And his goal was to gather all these diverse viewpoints from various Arabic sources into a single volume.
To create a one-stop shop for philosophical knowledge.
Exactly. So, his readers wouldn't have to track down all these different texts themselves.
Makes sense.
And he's very clear that the work is almost entirely based on Aristotle, as interpreted by Averroes.
Averroes, the commentator on Aristotle.
Yeah, whose interpretations were incredibly influential in both the Islamic and Christian worlds.
So it's Aristotle filtered through the lens of Averroes.
Precisely. And what's funny is that Falaquera actually claims that there's not a word in this entire composition that I say of my own.
So he's presenting it as a pure compilation.
Right. But, scholars who have studied the work closely have discovered something really interesting.
Why is that?
While he relies heavily on Averroes' middle commentaries on Aristotle, he's not just copying them word for word.
He's doing something more.
Yeah. Through careful selection, strategic combination of passages, even subtle abridgments, he often manages to present Aristotle's ideas with even greater clarity and coherence than Averroes himself.
So he's actually improving on Averroes.
In some ways, yes. And he might also insert a short passage from another author, like Avicenna, to address a particular point more effectively.
So there's a lot of thought going into how he's structuring this material.
Absolutely. It's a very deliberate process. And his audience, who, again, likely wouldn't have had access to the original sources, they're getting this incredibly comprehensive and well-organized presentation of Aristotelian thought in Hebrew.
It's like he's opening up a whole new world for them.
Yeah, he's making this knowledge accessible in a way that it hadn't been before.
Yep. And then we have Falaquera, the commentator, primarily known for his Mora HaMor, which means the guide to the guide.
A commentary on Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed.
And given that Maimonides himself actually cautioned against writing commentaries on his work.
Oh, yeah, he did.
This seems like a pretty bold move on Falaquera's part.
It definitely was. Maimonides specifically asked readers not to comment on or further explain his guide. But Falaquera recognized that the text was already being interpreted in various ways, and he thought some of those interpretations were inaccurate.
So he felt a need to set the record straight.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And his commentary really focuses on identifying Maimonides' philosophical sources.
Which is something scholars are still debating today.
Exactly. And by tracing those influences, by naming them explicitly, Falaquera aims to provide a more accurate understanding of Maimonides' arguments.
He wants to clarify what Maimonides is really saying.
And whether he agrees or disagrees with those sources.
Right, because Maimonides himself wasn't always straightforward about that. And in this role, as a commentator, it seems like Falaquera steps out of the shadows a bit more.
Yeah.
He starts offering his own opinions, and he even disagrees with Maimonides on occasion.
That's right. Unlike his encyclopedic work in the Mor HaMor, Falaquera speaks in his own voice. He comes across as this critical thinker who's not afraid to challenge even highly respected predecessors if he finds their arguments lacking.
So he's not just blindly following authority.
No, he's engaging in real philosophical debate. And that makes the commentary incredibly valuable for understanding Falaquera's own views on things like creation, the nature of God, prophecy, and the relationship between cause and effect.
So we get a deeper glimpse into his own thinking.
Absolutely.
Okay, and finally, we have Falaquera as exegete, as interpreter of Scripture. How did his philosophical leanings shape his understanding of the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic literature?
Well, Falaquera always maintained this strong conviction that the Torah is a source of profound truth, and that its teachings ultimately align with the truths of philosophy and science.
So no conflict there.
No, not for him. He believed that if there appeared to be a contradiction, it meant that the biblical passage needed to be interpreted correctly. And he saw philosophy as a valuable tool for doing that.
So philosophy helps us unlock the deeper meaning of Scripture.
Exactly. And he even believed that the Bible contains lots of scientific teachings and allusions, often expressed in veiled language. But he was also clear that if a philosophical idea directly contradicted a core tenet of the Torah, then that idea should be rejected.
So the Torah is the ultimate authority,
Yes, in his view.
but reason can help us understand it more fully.
Precisely. And his methods of interpretation were quite diverse. He employed allegorical readings, where the literal meaning of the text points to a deeper symbolic meaning. He identified metaphors, he offered scientific explanations for certain terms, and he really strived to uncover the inner meaning of the verses.
It sounds like a very nuanced approach.
It is. He moves back and forth between literal and allegorical interpretations, always aiming to reconcile the biblical text with what he considers to be rationally established truths.
So, bringing it all together, what would you say are the key takeaways regarding Falaquera's contributions and his significance, particularly for someone engaged in philosophical inquiry?
Well, I think Falaquera's primary contribution lies in his role as a facilitator of knowledge.
He makes knowledge accessible.
He does. He's a popularizer, a paraphraser, an encyclopedist, a commentator, an exegete.
He wears all the hats.
He really does. And while he may not have always sought to be radically original in his philosophical ideas, his methods of synthesizing, adapting, and presenting knowledge were incredibly creative.
And influential.
Hugely influential, especially in making the intellectual heritage of Greece and the Islamic world available to a wider Jewish audience.
Through the Hebrew language.
Exactly. He essentially democratized access to these ideas.
And he never wavered in his commitment to the idea that the Torah and the truths of philosophy and science are ultimately in harmony.
That's right. He approaches scripture with a philosophical mind, but always with deep respect for its authority.
And it's interesting, while he often presented a more traditional understanding of creation in his popular works, his commentary on Maimonides suggests a more nuanced perspective.
Yeah, perhaps aligning with Plato's concept of creation after non-existence.
This means
So instead of God creating everything ex nihilo, from nothing, this view suggests that God shaped and ordered pre-existing unformed matter.
oh, I see.
It's a subtle but important distinction, and Falaquera clearly engaged with a wide range of philosophical ideas.
Yeah.
You see an appreciation for both Aristotle and the more mystical concepts found in Neoplatonism, particularly through his engagement with Ibn Gabirol.
So he's not limiting himself to just one school of thought.
No, not at all. And despite all the controversy surrounding philosophy at the time, he continued to build bridges between these different worlds of thought.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into Falaquera's world, it's amazing how relevant his dedication to understanding and connecting different ways of knowing still feels today. I mean, for you, as someone who's deeply engaged in philosophical inquiry, I think his example raises some important questions.
Definitely.
How can we, in our own time, effectively engage with complex ideas, connect seemingly disparate fields, and make these insights accessible to a wider audience?
It's a challenge we're still grappling with.
Falaquera's life really highlights the enduring value of intellectual humility and this ongoing pursuit of knowledge.
Always striving to build bridges of understanding
Exactly.
across different perspectives and disciplines.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on.
I agree.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
And until next time, keep thinking, keep exploring, and keep connecting those dots.